Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you so much for inviting me to offer this brief presentation on the nature of Hindutva fascism and particularly Hindutva fascism in Aotearoa. I'm going to keep this presentation fairly brief with the idea that there are a number of resources available to further build on this on the Facebook page of CARE. Also, we are in the process of preparing three white papers that document the nature of Hindutva in Aotearoa that would have a little bit more details than what is spelled out in this presentation. So, in this particular talk, I will look at the history of Hindutva and its linkages with fascism. Then I will draw upon my own research program to explore the communicative strategies of Hindutva that will give us a sense of the ways in which digital platforms as well as organizations with presence in Aotearoa play pivotal roles in perpetuating the Hindutva ideology. Then we will turn to look at the nature of Hindutva violence, the scope of this violence in India, and the ways in which this violence manifests itself across the Indian diaspora, particularly in Western democracies. Then I will turn to the case of Hindutva in Aotearoa. I will walk you through some brief pieces of evidence and examine the communicative strategies being used there. And then finally wrap up offering some thoughts on potential strategies of resistance. Now, before I go into this talk, I want to acknowledge organizations, groups in Aotearoa, New Zealand, that have been pivotal in challenging Hindutva, particularly the Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians, API, which is present on Twitter and Facebook. I invite you to follow API on those platforms. Also, Hindus for Human Rights, Australia, New Zealand chapter, Indian Association of Minorities, Bhagat Singh Charitable Trust. These are some vital organizations that are doing work in challenging Hindutva. Also, please look at the work of United Against Hate. That has been particularly critical in terms of bringing out the voices of Muslim whānau experiencing the Islamophobia that is spread by Hindutva. Now, in some of the slides going forward, there are going to be images that might be triggering, so please feel free to turn off the screen. If I go into these images, I will try to give you some warning before going into the slide stating that now we are going to show some imagery that captures the violence of Hindutva, particularly on digital platforms. So, Hindutva is a political ideology that is distinct from the religion of Hinduism. As a political ideology, it seeks to construct India as a Hindu nation based upon the concept of a monolithic race or what it describes as a Hindu jati that is indigenous to India, according to this argument, which then is the source of Hindu Sanskriti or Hindu culture. And this monolithic Hindu culture then is also framed as indigenous to India, but connected to this notion of a Hindu jati and within the overarching framework of a Hindu Rashtra or nation. So Muslims and Christians are portrayed as the outsiders of the nation. And to the extent that Muslims and Christians accept their outsider status and recognize India as a Hindu nation, they can be in India. Um, so there is an inherent emphasis on constructing Hinduism as indigenous to India, and then pushing that recognition as the basis for organizing how the state relates to Muslims and Christians. And then other faiths, the faiths such as Buddhism and Jainism, are seen as or are projected as emergent out of Hinduism, so therefore part of the broader Hindu umbrella. On this note, and particularly with reference to the question of indigeneity, India has diverse Adivasi communities. Adivasi communities often live as tribes with distinct value systems, knowledge systems, and cultural practices. For Hindutva and its propaganda infrastructure, Adivasis are constructed as part of the Hindu religion and the broader Hindu umbrella. So you can see in the ideology its fascist tenets, and the origins of Hindutva ideology and its emergence within the context of the freedom struggle in India, and particularly within the realm of the claims to sovereignty emergent from this freedom struggle, but framed within the Hindutva framework as claims to constructing India as a Hindu nation. And the 1920s, when this ideology started becoming mainstream in India, it in many ways mirrored the German Nazi ideology and Italian fascist ideology. This, therefore, was evident in the construction of race purity as the basis for the nation, but also in terms of the ways in which the Hindutva sought to create a pedagogy of the Hindu nation using methods of training that mirrored German and Italian fascism in terms of techniques of disciplining, learning to use instruments as tools of violence or violent um, response, and working through various techniques of violence in order to safeguard the Hindu nation. Now, if you consider, therefore, the very explicit intersections of Hindutva and white supremacist fascist movements, you see this play out in terms of particular connections. Now, in the earlier slide, I pointed toward the ideological linkages. Now, if you actually look beyond these ideological linkages to specific movements and specific figures in the white supremacist infrastructure, you then see the patterns of flow from and through the Hindutva infrastructure. Consider, for instance, the emergence of traditionalists within white supremacist movements, turning to notions of tradition as the basis for maintaining and perpetuating racial purity. Now, this traditionalist thread of white supremacy often draws from the writings of Julius Evola, who was a traditionalist. And Evola's work connects with Hinduism, and particularly the caste infrastructure of Hinduism, to put forth the notion of racial purity, race purity. So, caste hierarchy as the basis for conceptualizing race purity and race hierarchy, where people are predisposed to be located in particular spaces within the social structure based upon where they have been born. Similarly, in Evola's work, you see the construction of contemporary times as the Kali Yuga. Again, this draws from Hinduism, the time of moral and intellectual turmoil. And therefore, the solution to this is by turning to logics of purity based upon systems of hierarchy and turning to cultural traditions. So, in that sense, you see continual flow of ideas between Hindutva and white supremacy. You certainly see references to aspects of Hinduism, the caste structure in the manifestos of white supremacist extremists. And here it is also worth noting that Evola and references to Evola and Evola's books form a key infrastructure in far right spaces across the globe. At the same time, one of the key publishing houses that is at the center of disseminating ideas of white supremacy, Arctos, was for a certain number of years located in India, connected in some ways to the ISKCON movement. And there is a really critical thread to explore as well in terms of the linkages among Hinduism, Hindutva, Hinduism's caste structure, and turns to pagan culture, paganism, eco paganism in various white supremacist movements, but also among white adherents of Hinduism. So you see flow of ideas. At the same time, you see the flow of material resources. The Arctos publishing house is an important example, which then also, in addition to publishing white supremacist texts, has published texts on various aspects of Hinduism. And then you see flow of symbolic resources, the flow of communication across spaces. So both Hindutva and white supremacy uh, in the contemporary context draw upon the projection of the fear of the Muslim to create their infrastructures of hate and violence. So they converge on Islamophobia. You know, the fear, hatred, and prejudice against Islam or Muslims is an important thread, and I will show in a little bit how that plays out communicatively. This is often legitimized through hegemonic structures and institutions, including the security intelligence community. This we see particularly in the backdrop of 9/11, where in various security spaces, we start noticing the mainstreaming or platforming of Hindutva or Hindutva ideologues and their approaches to Muslims as sources of terror. So, this institutional approach to Muslims as sources of terror in the security apparatus, and therefore as natural sites and bodies of surveillance, that directly connects both Hindutva and white supremacist ideology. And this then becomes the basis for mobilizing targeted violence that is directed at Muslims, sexual violence that is directed at Muslims. So we have seen this, both of these aspects in terms of riots targeting Muslims, the death of Muslims in India at the hands of Hindutva forces. We have seen sexual violence directed at Muslim women, and then sort of the infrastructures of these riots and pogroms um, set up by the hate rhetoric of Hindutva. So, in most recent instances, now one of the arguments when we present uh, the sort of infrastructure of Hindutva. And when we talk about that in Aotearoa, one of the responses is that we don't really assess this threat to be of significance here in Aotearoa. And here I would like to point out uh, two particular incidences of recent violence that is tied to the Hindutva. One is the violence that we have witnessed in Australia that is directly connected to Hindutva, with the Hindutva subscribers attacking Sikh and Muslim communities. Now, a large part of this attack is carried out digitally, but then through practices such as doxing, sharing confidential information about Muslim or Sikh activists, the violence sort of start materializing in brick and mortar context. And we see this also in the United Kingdom, in Leicester, with sort of the riots that are seen as riots between Hindus and Muslims. But what really happens here is that Hindutva subscribers take out marches chanting Jai Shri Ram. Now, Jai Shri Ram is a chant that is sort of directly tied to Hindutva's attacks on mosques, particularly the Babri Masjid, which was a key site of attack by Hindutva ideologues in the 1990s. And therefore, the Babri Masjid context and the demolition of the mosque becomes a setting within which sort of the slogan Jai Shri Ram becomes a polarizing slogan. And we see in Leicester how the groups of youth chanting the slogan walk through Muslim neighborhoods. And this becomes the context within which there are anxieties that are created in the community that contribute to the communal tensions and ultimately lead to violence in the communities. Now, here, what I wanted to point out is the intersection between Hindutva and white supremacy. When the Leicester riots started taking place, um, uh, the white supremacist networks picked up on the Hindutva propaganda targeting Muslims. And here you have Tommy Robinson, who is associated with the Proud Boys and the infrastructure of white supremacy in the United Kingdom, particularly Islamophobic white supremacy, then picks up this instance of communal violence, um, picks up the frame that is created by Hindutva of Muslims attacking peaceful Hindu communities, and then places that on Telegram, which then leads to or contributes to the sort of polarizing Islamophobic discourse, as you can see on Telegram here. Now, Robinson then gets invited by Nupur J. Sharma. This is a Hindutva media person that runs a digital platform called Op India, which carries a range of hate pieces targeting Muslims. And Nupur Sharma talks about interviewing Robinson. So that interview eventually didn't go through because many Hindus complained to her that if she went ahead with the interview, there would be greater scrutiny of Hindus. So the interview didn't go through. But what that sort of interaction demonstrates is the convergence of narratives and the spaces of flows that I was talking about earlier. So the narratives of Hindutva and white supremacy converge on the concept of Muslim population explosion. So the white replacement theory that we see in white supremacist communicative infrastructures is something we see as Hindu replacement theory and the Muslim population explosion. Now, here it is worth noting that Muslims are a small minority in India. Hindus are a majority population. So this construction that the Hindu is in danger, or what in Hindi is articulated as Hindu khatre mein hai, is deployed precisely to mark Muslims as the sites of violence. Similarly, the narrative of love jihad, which is Muslim men targeting Hindu women, and particularly the Hindu womb, to reproduce Muslim babies. So the reproductive takeover of the womb becomes a powerful narrative around which Hindutva is organized. So we see the flow of love jihad narrative once again from the Hindutva ecosystem into the white supremacist networks and back. Now, with the love jihad narrative, then we have seen the ways in which the digital deployment of the love jihad narrative has been connected to the targeting of Muslims, and has shaped um, um, sort of incidences of violence, including murders of Muslims. The third the kind of narrative that is often circulated in both Hindutva and white supremacist spaces is the concept of Sharia law, Muslims bringing in Sharia law into democracies, and through that process, then threatening democracies. So, in terms of the communicative strategies of Hindutva and white supremacy, we can see a few key strategies. One is the production of the Muslim, as the other, the and other strategy is one of erasing Muslim voices in order to assert Hindu hegemony. At the same time, the communication infrastructure of Hindutva deploys inversion, where it turns materiality on its head. This is a really important concept. So, Hindus are a majority in India, with Hindutva hate, rhetoric, and violence. It is Muslims who are being threatened. At the same time, this violence is upheld by the narrative that it is the Hindu who is under threat, and under threat of extinction. So this is what we call communicative inversions. White replacement theory narrative is a powerful example of communicative inversion. So these kinds of communicative inversions are continually carried out in the Hindutva infrastructures. And then equivocation, particularly in Western democracies, we certainly see that in Aotearoa, Hindutva aligned organizations, on one hand, put their resources, put their support, exchange expertise with Hindutva organizations in India. On the other hand, they deny such linkages. You can see this in the context of Hindu Council, where it is ambiguous about its relationship with the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, or the VHP, which had earlier uh, by the CIA fact book. Not that we should use the CIA fact book as a sole measure of whether an entity is an extremist entity or not, but the VHP had been categorized as a militant nationalist religious organization. And that is connected to the sorts of violence that we have seen emerge in India within the context of the VHP. So the Hindu Council um, sort of connects with VHP ideologues. In fact, you see Hindu Council New Zealand leaders in India meeting with Hindutva ideologues, leaders, at the same time in the diaspora, narrating itself in its public face as promoting peace, as Hinduism being the religion of peace. So this kind of movement, on one hand, attaching to hate and attaching to ideologues that perpetuate the hate, and on the other hand, narrating itself as a peaceful organization that promotes peace becomes an important strategy that upholds Hindutva organizing in Aotearoa, to the point where activists, both Muslim activists and Indian diaspora activists, continue to document the ways in which Hindutva aligned organizations are funded and supported by the Crown structure. So, this is a brief definition of communicative inversion. I have already talked about this. I will send the slides so that you can have a chance to look through what I'm talking about. But it is basically turning materiality on its head. And this is often seen through the construct of Hinduphobia. So, as we have seen the rise of Hindutva, as we have seen the political consolidation of Hindutva through the Bharatiya Janata Party and the emergence of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister and his hegemony over two electoral terms. Simultaneously, we see the ways in which the narrative of Hinduphobia, the fear of the Hindu, is being produced in order to silence critiques of Hindutva. So anyone critiquing Hindutva, and I have experienced this personally in my work on Hindutva, anyone critiquing Hindutva becomes Hinduphobe and therefore a target for attacks. So Hinduphobia as a communicative inversion, then it is used to silence dissent, to attack dissenting voices. In India, we see the imprisonment of protesters. Globally, we have seen attacks on academics being carried out under the narrative of Hindutva. When I was being attacked here in Aotearoa, over 50 community organizations here in Aotearoa wrote to Massey, carried out letter writing campaigns framing my critiques of Hindutva as Hinduphobia. And then organizing and mobilizing the narrative of Hinduphobia to attack progressive politics. So recently in Seattle, for instance, we have seen the ways in which Shama Sawant and Indian diaspora activists and broader South Asian activists have organized to ban caste. Now, for the Hindutva ideologues, this is bringing Hinduism in bad light, and therefore you see the performance of communicative inversion. So you take something like caste and ban on casteism, and that is turned into a narrative of attack on Hindus. So the one of the ingredients of this narrative structure of Hindutva is this co-option of the language of decolonization, co-option of the language of indigeneity to mobilize the hate in the diaspora. So in fact, you will see many Hindutva ideologues, including the Hindutva infrastructure in Australia, that is fairly active and a key source of feeding disinformation into the Hindutva infrastructure in Aotearoa. And that infrastructure often draws upon indigeneity, aboriginal claims of decolonization in order to build the Hinduphobia narrative. So it is in this backdrop, then we see the growth of Hindutva violence. And even as this violence is carried out, attention is shifted away from it through the framing of Hinduphobia. Now, in terms of the violence in India, and I will quickly run through this because I know that I'm sort of coming to a close of my half an hour. We see this in the form of various attacks on mosques, churches, organized violence, rape. We see murders, particularly cow vigilantism, where Muslim community members have been particularly targeted under the disinformation that they have been trading cows, and that is then used to carry out violence. But this material infrastructure of violence is upheld by a discursive architecture. So communication is an important um, source of this violence. Now, here in Aotearoa, then, we see the disinformation network of Hindutva play out in terms of the ways in which the disinformation flows. So, CARE organized a conference sorry, it was the co-sponsor of a conference organized by a collective of academics and activists called Dismantling Global Hindutva, based upon concerns about the pernicious effects of Hindutva on the Indian diaspora globally. And what you then see here is that when that conference was turned into a target, um, it was projected as a source of Hinduphobia, as an attack on Hindus. And this was the basis then for an entire online network to start targeting the academics and activists, including doxing them, placing their information online, and threatening them with death threats, as well as threats of rape, and threatening their families with rape and murder as well. Now, this infrastructure that we see globally also flowed into Aotearoa, and we at CARE, because CARE was a co-sponsor of the conference, directly became the site of attack of Hindutva. And it is at that point that our white papers on Islamophobia and Hindutva started being picked up by these Hindutva networks. And they started crafting a range of disinformation pieces around how CARE was being funded by China, CARE was being funded by um, Islamist sources to attack India. At the crux of this infrastructure of hate disseminated by Hindutva is this white yogini based out of Australia, Sarah Gates, whose Twitter account is an important node both in the violence that we see in Australia as well as in the violence that we see in Leicester. But this Twitter account actually gained popularity through its targeting of CARE and me and our work. And it, in that process, gained influence, gained traction, and then started attacking other academics and activists, and then started gaining the kind of legitimacy that would get this person invited to various Hindutva platforms, Hindutva based television channels, Hindutva based YouTube channels, to talk about the threat of Hinduphobia in Australia, New Zealand, and how Hindus are being targeted. So you see again, how this infrastructure flows. And in the case of the targeting of CARE, then it was framed as an attack on all Hindus, although the CARE white paper and my media interviews were quite explicit about the emphasis on Hindutva as a political ideology that is framed as an attack on all Hindus. And then you can see this narrative of Maoism, of Chinese influence, and foreign interference. So pretty soon, researchers at CARE found themselves as part of a network map that was being created by Hindutva proponents, suggesting that there is this network of Chinese Communist Party forces and Islamist forces that are directed toward breaking India, that are working through CARE and the activist networks in Aotearoa. Now, here is a key element of this disinformation infrastructure is the way in which then it gets picked up by Hindu organizations or organizations that claim to be representing Hindus, such as Hindu Council of New Zealand and Hindu Youth. As I earlier pointed out, Hindu Council of New Zealand has had linkages with VHP in various forms, including in its naming, and at the same time, equivocating on this as a strategy. But this is sort of a key piece of evidence in terms of the ways in which these networks of disinformation work. So the disinformation that was being circulated by Hindutva ideologues in India and globally about the dismantling global Hindutva conference then became the basis for the petition and the letter writing campaign here in Aotearoa that was being carried out by Hindu youth. Here's a figure of Hindutva that you would be familiar with, Roy Counts. And Roy Counts, earlier we have seen through Byron's work about his the relationships with Kelvin Knapp and the networks of white supremacy. Um, Counts, when this Hindutva campaign was being carried out targeting care, Counts put on um, program, a segment that talked about, there is no Islamophobia in New Zealand. Who are these Hindu terrorists that Professor Datta is referring to? And then sort of suggesting that this is part of a larger attack on Hindus and racism toward Hindus. And it's at that point, various Muslim and Sikh activists in the Indian community started going into Khan's digital platforms and taking screenshots of his Islamophobic posts. And what you see here is the sort of Islamophobia that is spread on digital infrastructures in Aotearoa by someone who is a media person that has been connected to a platform like Apna Network New Zealand that has gotten state funding under ethnic communities and diversity grants. So it's quite powerful in terms of what is being funded and the networks there. Here, I would also like to point out, and this is an important point to note, is that on the show hosted by Counts, you have various mainstream politicians from the National Party, from Labour, from the Greens, and from uh, New Zealand First and ACT appear. So this really raises important questions about the complicity of the political class in perpetuating this hate infrastructure. So these are some particular examples of Hindutva that we see in Aotearoa. This is a group. It's a Facebook group called Hindus in New Zealand. And for the time frame that I was looking at the content in this group, um, uh, posts after posts um, uh, construct this notion of the Muslim as um, an invader and sort of perpetuate various Islamophobic frames. Now, if you all recall, when the um, uh, attack happened on Lynn Mall and connected to um, a person that subscribed to the ISIS ideology, the Hindutva networks online picked this up to suggest that that attack was a product of appeasing Muslims in New Zealand. You can see messages targeting the Prime Minister. There were violent messages, sexually violent messages targeting the Prime Minister. They were often coming from Hindutva accounts. In fact, in my analysis, what I found is that 75% of the Islamophobia in the backdrop of the Lynn Mall attack was coming from Hindutva accounts. At the same time, this the hate was intersecting with and engaging in dialogue with white supremacist hate. Now, these are more examples. What I just wanted to highlight here is that you see community leaders. Ilango Krishnamurti is a key person in the labor network, for instance, that is disseminating that disinformation that is seeded by Hindutva in terms of, CARE's work and the Hinduphobia in that work. So when actually you track these networks of disinformation, these linkages become quite clear. And also, what becomes clear is the mainstreaming of Hindutva ideology in Aotearoa. And this is another example. So there are diaspora newspapers like the Indian News that are really propaganda outfits for Hindutva. But if you look at who appears on Indian News, you have Gaurav Sharma there, You have Chris Luxon appear there. A range of politicians appear on that platform. This is an example of a film that is a BJP Hindutva propaganda film called the Kashmir Files. And initially, when this film was going to be released here in Aotearoa, the Muslim community raised rightful concerns about Islamophobia that is being promoted in the film. The chief censor decided at that point, because of the complaints being raised, to follow the process and re-review the rating of the film, and the rating was changed. While it was going through the review, the film was initially um, pulled in terms of the original dates it was supposed to be launched on, had to sort of be changed. And this is the point of time where the Hindutva network in India goes on sort of full steam, talking about how New Zealand has been appeasing Muslims. But what I want to point out here is sort of the what lies at the heart of this narrative is that Muslim radicals, are um, using undemocratic processes to target New Zealand democracy. And this is a classic case of communicative inversion, because really what the chief censor was doing was following the institutional process. When complaints are raised about, say, a particular rating or content of a film, then it has to go through that review process. Now, it is in that backdrop that we see these kinds of hateful messages, such as referring to the former Prime Minister Ardern, I believe the darling of the left. And you can then look further into this, um, in terms of how this narrative constructs Islamophobia. This is a sexually violent message with an image of the Prime Minister wearing the hijab, and that becomes an ongoing narrative. But also, then this turns into this idea of the Prime Minister being a terrorist sympathizer, and then that then serves as a basis for chains of attacks that are directly targeted at her. But what I find really quite powerful within this infrastructure then is the ways in which that infrastructure gets picked up by New Zealand politicians. And you have here Melissa Lee, who then jumps in and talks about being uncomfortable. Freedom of expression is incredibly important, and needs to make a statement. And then you have Winston Peters there, who talks about this as censorship and attack on freedom of New Zealanders, while the chief censor really was following the process. And then this picked up by Mahesh Bindra, who thanks Peters for standing up for freedom and justice again. Here, it is really critical to note that Mahesh Bindra is someone who has had historic ties with um, Hindutva, and he talks about this, and he's actually quite vocal about this. But also, he has visited, on his visits to India, along with members of Hindu Council, he has visited Hindutva ideologues. So that interplay is quite powerful. You also see here that Bindra is tagging Muktish Pardeshi, who's the High Commissioner of India at that point. And that really raises critical questions about the nature of foreign interference as it connects with Hindutva. And then Pardeshi goes on to release a statement about Kashmir Files and the government's response. So you think about a film and its a rating, the chief censor following process, these politicians getting involved, and then a high commission getting involved to issue a statement. So that really gives you a sense in terms of the um, institutional infrastructure of Hindutva and how it flows. I want to wrap up then by talking about the ways in which Hindutva is and can be resisted. In Aotearoa, we have had a long history, and this is something we ought to feel very proud of. That we have had a long history, at least a decade-long history of resisting Hindutva. One might say that really Hindutva picked up steam and its presence in Aotearoa um, uh, for about a decade, it's almost 10 years back. But since the time that Hindutva started appearing in mainstream through various organizations, the protest against Hindutva also started building registers. So as long as we note the history of Hindutva in Aotearoa, we also note simultaneously the history of resistance to it. Here, I note the work of the activist Dr. Sapna Samant, who has continually been raising questions and concerns about the Hindu Council, the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, or the HSS. And this activist work dismantles the communicative erasures perpetuated by mainstream parties and state agencies. And here I want to note that for a number of Indian activists that have documented the presence of Hindutva and have talked to various politicians about it, often a consistent narrative is one of being gaslighted and stonewalled and not being heard. In the midst of that kind of gaslighting, these activists have continued to build a register. And you see this in the blogs, for instance, that are published by the Aotearoa Alliance of Progressive Indians that counter the disinformation infrastructure of Hindutva. The organizing of activists also then dismantle the narrative incoherences in the Royal Commission hearings. So, say, for instance, diaspora Indian activists, Indian Muslim activists who have raised concerns about Hindutva in some of the hearing sessions have noted that there have been no follow up. And noting and publicly articulating that becomes a basis for building a register and dismantling some of the rhetoric around the responses to the Royal Commission hearings. This renders visible the political strategies, including the complicity of the political class in various events, for instance, organized by the Hindu Council. You see a range of politicians all the way from Helen Clark to Winston Peters. You see the presence of members of the police, and activists have been rendering visible these kinds of political connections. For instance, they have been raising concerns about the presence of senior members of the police or their partners in events that are organized by Hindutva related organizations. They are building registers for pedagogy, and part of this conversation, I think, is an ongoing part of our work in building this kind of solidarity. They work continually to build and cultivate resilience. So when the work of CARE came under attack, for instance, and there were over 50 letters sent to Massey at that time, simultaneously there were 5 or 6 organizations that sent counter letters to Massey saying that this work is really important in building a register to document Hindutva. And that kind of strategic solidarity is really vital to cultivating resilience and then developing a long-term strategy. So really thinking about how to work through the structures of the settler colonial state and its organizing forms of whiteness, and how to develop a presence over the long run to continue to challenge Hindutva because it is so ensconced in society in Aotearoa. So, in conclusion, Hindutva fascism is linked with extreme violence. We see the intersections of Hindutva fascism with white supremacy. Hindutva is networked, so it is present locally. Its architecture and organizational structure draws from the fascist organizing structure of the VHP and the RSS, but that structure then is reproduced in the networks of Hindutva globally. There are a significant number of Hindutva organizations in Aotearoa. Many of these organizations are explicit. In the backdrop of the attacks on CARE and Massey University, a number of these organizations came out and signed a petition. So a great place to actually see a list of these organizations that subscribe to the Hindutva Disinformation Network is to actually look at the organizations that signed that petition. Hindutva very much is mainstreamed into ministries, into the security police apparatus. That's a key concern of activists, into interfaith spaces. In fact, most of the interfaith spaces have been taken over by Hindutva, such that when you consider this question of who is representing Hinduism, ironically, it is the subscribers of the Hindutva faith. And when or the Hindutva ideology. And when this is continually pointed out to leaders of interfaith, there is often a tendency to erase those conversations. And then, as I was pointing out earlier, it's really critical to look at intelligence, security, police, and the flows of Islamophobia and how that intersects with Hindutva and white supremacy there. It's critical to look at community leaders and their ties to Hindutva. There are a number of community leaders, for instance, that are directly aligned with the Hindutva ideology, that have received various forms of funding from ministries, including the Ministry of Ethnic Communities. So it's really critical to interrogate that kind of funding and what is actually framed as community funding or ethnic community funding, and then consider the ways in which whiteness and this perpetuation of notions of white multiculturalism becomes the basis for sponsoring Hindutva, because this notion of Hindu essentialism based upon the idea of a monolithic Hindu culture, Hindu race, appeals to particular strands of whiteness. So there are mutual affinities that need to be interrogated. Thank you so much once again for giving me this opportunity to participate in this dialogue. And it is really wonderful that anti fascist activists in Aotearoa are looking at Hindutva. For many years, this has been an ongoing challenge of Indian diaspora activists in terms of how to build solidarities. And this is a really important opening for starting to craft those solidarities. So really, Namihinui, appreciate your support and your engagement in this dialogue. Please do feel free to write to me, connect with me, and I look forward to our work together.